Feingold is joining us from Taipei. He's a senior advisor specializing in global finance and policy issues for the DC International Advisory Firm. Why don't we start where Pandong left off? Duterte introducing Premier Lee for his remarks, talked about charting the future direction of China and the Philippines and their shared strategic partnership. Premier Lee is going to stay on after the Manila meetings. He's going to have bilateral talks with Duterte. We've seen the ups and downs in this relationship. Talk to me about where that relationship is today and where can it go moving forward?
Well, obviously, there's been a dramatic improvement since Duterte took office a little over a year ago. And as the previous correspondent mentioned, it's about common prosperity. And there's tremendous room for growth in trade between the two countries. And I think what we saw over the last few days of summits, whether it was the APEC meeting in Vietnam or the East Asia Summit in the Philippines, is that the leaders of the countries who attended these meetings are looking for win-win. So the summits occurred with a very productive atmosphere, people focused on common prosperity and common goals. And that's really a positive outcome for the peoples and the companies of all these countries who attended these meetings. So unlike sometimes when we see summits in other parts of the world that often end in acrimony or the lack of a clear consensus, these meetings went very well, and that certainly applies to the relationship between China and the Philippines.
Ross, Lee talked about advancing the East Asia economic community. That's a far cry from the type of language we were hearing from the U.S. president, who isn't talking about integration or globalization. He just wants bilateral deals. Again, China out in front on the globalization stage. Is the train leaving the station? Is the U.S. going to lose out in any chance of playing a role in the new emerging economic order there in Asia?
I think what we might see are two tracks. So on the one hand, we see the multilateral efforts. China is very active with that, RCEP. We see the possibility of a reconstituted TPP among the remaining countries who want to continue to negotiate that agreement. On the other hand, we still see President Trump negotiating and advancing on behalf of the interests of U.S. companies. So while he was in China, a large number of deals were announced between U.S. companies and China. So we see these two tracks. On the one hand, it's multilateral agreements. On the other hand, President Trump and American companies will continue to seek opportunities outside of those multilateral agreements. And ultimately, it still could be a win-win situation.
It also seems like there's progress on the South China Sea territorial issue, with, of course, Lee talking about the code of conduct. Where do you see that issue going?
Well, the implementation remains to be seen, but again, that was one of the positive outcomes of recent days' meetings, where there was consensus on moving forward. And most notably, we didn't see acrimony. We didn't see any national leader come out of these meetings unhappy about these discussions on a framework. So if they could actually agree to something and it could be implemented, again, that's a positive for all the stakeholders involved. It removes a hurdle to good relations between ASEAN countries and the claimants and China. And that could be a positive for the people of these various countries. So the implementation is unknown, but the fact that they're talking and the talks are positive, I mean, that's something that we should all be very supportive of.
Ross, one final question for you. You mentioned APEC, ASEAN. We saw the state visits by President Xi to Laos and Vietnam. Of course, Lee staying on in Manila. Talk to me about what you see as the major takeaways in the last week or so in the region itself.
Well, clearly, there's still an appetite for inbound investment. So the countries such as Laos or the Philippines that still have room for tremendous economic growth are still emerging from poverty. They have a very large appetite for foreign investment, whether it's from China or the United States. And this appetite for investment and trade will clearly lead to positive outcomes, whether it's in the multilateral forums, which China is now taking leadership, or bilateral with the United States. So even President Trump had very positive things to say about his meetings with President Duterte. And that's very similar to what we see from the Chinese side, where they're having very positive meetings with their counterparts in the Philippines. So again, commerce could lead the way, and the meetings were very positive. And there's tremendous room for growth, and that creates opportunities and win-win for all involved.
Ross Feingold joining us from Taipei. Thanks so much.